So let's get going. Let's apply the, why was the conditionality phase so disastrous? And there are two reasons why I think it was disastrous. Conditionality worked by the World Bank, the IMF going and saying, we'll give you money as long as you adopt policies that we think are right. One criticism was to say the policies we think are right, that the World Bank thought were right, weren't good policies. Sometimes that was true, but mostly it wasn't. Even if the policies recommended were good policies, why was it a bad idea? Partly the answer is that the moment when aid had real power to change policies were when governments really needed the money. They really needed the money when they were in crisis. And they got to crisis if they'd made some major policy mistakes. So let's take Nigeria in the mid-1980s. Huge spending spree when the oil was there, a lot of borrowing, then the oil price crashed, crisis. Spending had to be cut because instead of being able to borrow, you had to pay back, and there was much less oil money. So what the IMF came in with and the World Bank came in with was to say, we'll actually lend you some money so that the amount of cutting you'll have to do is less. But we'll take the blame for the cuts. There have to be cuts and we'll take the blame. Government liked that because the government then said, the reason why we're having to cut is nothing to do with our policies. It's because of these cruel people from Washington. We don't want to do it, but they're forcing us to do it. What that did was utterly confuse the population. The population looked back on the good times as times when policies were good. But actually it was disastrous policies during the period of high oil prices that had led to the crisis. And so instead of building a critical mass of informed citizens, Nigeria managed to build a critical mass of misinformed citizens thanks to policy conditionality. So very dysfunctional social learning. And then further, if we apply the Bates analysis, and Bates says, really, these dysfunctional policies are chosen by elites for their own interests. If a foreign agency like the World Bank or the IMF comes and says, you can't do that one, you can't do that policy, you're not changing the elites or their interests. You're just taking away one policy instrument from them. They can't get their interests satisfied with this policy. Then the danger is they pursue the same interests with policies that are even more damaging. And so they still get the distributive outcomes they want, but using yet more damaging techniques. So that policy conditionality phase was disastrous. And then a critique of aid developed, which basically said, by giving governments money without the need to tax, that reduces the incentive of governments to build tax capacity. And because of that, they never acquire an interest in growing the economy. And because citizens are not paying tax, citizens never have an interest in holding government to account. And if you remember back to our political model, the development of a tax system is fundamental. So that is a real concern, that aid can reduce the incentive for taxation. There are ways around that. Aid can be given pro rata with tax revenues. But that's where there's a big similarity with natural resources. A country like Nigeria raises 70% of its revenues from oil. Its tax as a share of non-oil GDP is only 3%. Tiny. My own country, Britain, the government reaches into my pocket and finds on average 37% of GDP. So 37% in Britain, 3% in Nigeria. citizens in Nigeria have much less reason to hold the government to account. The government of Nigeria much less reason to try and grow the economy because it doesn't capture much of the gain.